Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.
Hello, and welcome to a cheeky midweek edition of Tottenham Hotspur, the Spurs pod about Spurs pods that doesn't know when it's outstayed its welcome. Before I dive in, I'll do some housekeeping. My name is Ian. You can follow me on Bluesky at iain.coys.social, Ian spelled iain, or you can follow the show at Tottenham Hotspur. So, Tottenham Hotspur actually won a game, which is a pleasant surprise considering our recent form, beating Southampton 3-1. I watched the game with my local supporters club, Montgomery County Spurs. I'm actually the chair of that group, so shout out to all my friends who come to watch games at St. Drew Brewing in Gaithersburg. I always find it's nice to watch Spurs games with friends generally, but especially so at the moment. It's like a form of group therapy. So Spurs slipped by a terrible Southampton team. I wouldn't say we were lucky, but we weren't unlucky, if that makes sense. We scored some good goals, especially Johnson's second, which really showed some confidence, which at the moment I didn't really think Brendan had. Nice little touch to get the ball past the goalkeeper. Generally speaking, I'd say the game was kind of ruined by VAR again, which was disappointing after what happened with the Chelsea game. Other things, we were fortunately saved another spat with Ange. I think if we lost that game, there's a good chance that the fans would have stormed the field and sort of hung him up from the bronze cockerel. And I'm glad that we've got some momentum going into Thursday. I hear the change for Tottenham protest went well. Seems to be they're either growing or at the very least they're not shrinking. So good luck to them in their goals. I'll talk about change for Tottenham in another podcast and the sort of content that they're putting out. And in fact, that's why I'm doing a mini review today. I'm actually hoping later in the week to come back to the Twitter spaces and YouTube videos that Change for Tottenham have been recording over the last few months. I think it's really an interesting topic. So the pod review this week. Seeing as Spurs won, I have listened to, I think, about a dozen different Spurs podcasts. I've been focusing on fan pods this week. Sorry to say, listening at 1.5 times speed. So I'm not going to be talking about the journalist pods like Golden Guest Talk Tottenham, the Tottenham Way, or View from the Lane. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on those which have a heavy fan element to them. And I always struggle in the last few episodes of thinking how to organize my running list, my running order. And this week it was kind of decided for me. As I listened to a podcast in the kitchen in my house on Sunday night, there was a curse word that was uttered that was repeated by my 5-year-old that I don't think I can fully process at the moment to hear that word coming out of a 5-year-old's mouth. So I decided to look into and identify the most profane and most clean Spurs pods that are available to us through the good services of Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Acast and what have you. So that's the order this week. Generally speaking, what I've learned is if you want a clean podcast to listen without headphones on in your house, surrounded by a child, maybe go for one of the journalism pods, like the ones like I mentioned earlier. So let's go through the podcasts and talk about the vibe. Post Southampton, post a win, feels kind of nice on this show to be digesting what content people have been making after something good happened, as opposed to the litany of financial reports and losses and other belly aching that's happened over the last few weeks. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about process. I dug into the transcripts on Apple Podcasts and searched through for keywords of various different curse words, different swear words, and just counted everything up. So 3 podcasts came out with no score. They had no foul language in them whatsoever. The first one that I want to talk about is So Spurs, which is a really good show. There was a minimal Southampton talk, and in fact, it was quite short, but it was the best Frankfurt preview that I listened to before I listened to The Lab, which had Flav talking to a European football expert. So So Spurs was a good listen this week and brief, if you're looking for something to kind of get you in the mood for Frankfurt on Thursday. Come and Discuss Spurs also had no foul language as far as I could tell, but I also had no access to the transcript through Apple Podcasts at the time of recording. This was a very happy episode. Stu set the bar for what he expected from the show, the host, very early. They had some frustrations with the Spurs' performance in the second half and the fan response to Ear Cupgate. They actually have an interesting podcast today on the financial report, if you wanted another take on the Spurs end-of-year finances. And they also had a nice discussion about the captaincy, especially the role that our young players can have in taking on leadership roles. Another podcast that I wasn't able to score because I didn't have access to an automated transcript was the Spurs Diehards Tottenham Till I Die YouTube channel, which is a mouthful to say out loud. I think it's a YouTube only channel. It's fairly new. It's been going 9 months, I believe they said on the stream, and they live stream pretty much immediately after the game. I'm going to be honest, I thought it was going to be a little bit cringe based upon seeing some sort of older English gentlemen. I thought I was going to get some real juicy takes, but in fact I was really pleasantly surprised. They were all absolutely lovely guys. They had a great sense of fan engagement, doing a bit of a roll call part of the way into their stream, and they had some really nice points about whether Brennan Johnson is confident enough to play for Spurs right now. So that was very cool. And generally speaking, something else that caught my ear was that they were expressly in, which is quite novel in a lot of the podcasts I listen to, where somebody would just state their preference like that, where it isn't Ange out, get rid of him. So, in terms of the podcasts that did mention some curse words, and I will be avoiding listening to in my house without headphones on in the future, at number 9 we have An Echo of Glory. This is a fan-hosted podcast, but it has a very professional setup, and I believe several of the hosts are media professionals, if not TV hosts. I found it interesting that they were critical of the Change for Tottenham protests approaches, as well as their messaging. So that was quite a novel listen if you're looking for that type of content. At number 8, Echoes of Glory had 3 curse words. It was a little gloomy about the outlook for the remaining games in our season, which is not totally unfounded, but not exactly what I was looking for this week. But I'm glad I stuck with it, because they had an extensive trivia section towards the end of the podcast, which I quite enjoyed. At number 7, The Cheese Room, 10 curse words. I found that their discussion about Brennan Johnson and the team's physicality was an interesting listen. At number 6, The Extra Inch, they had 13 curse words. They talk about our use of forwards and their role in our defensive play is worth listening to. And they are just generally done with Postecoglou, if you couldn't tell from the last few weeks or months of their podcasts. Nathan did coin the phrase Postecoglian to refer to a style of football, which I much prefer over Ange ball. And generally speaking, the lads were quite excited for the Frankfurt game. Something I did enjoy about this podcast was the TV and media talk at the end, which was a bit of a throwback to some of their earlier podcasts many years ago, and a nice reminder of what they sound like when they're talking about things that they enjoy. And I totally identify with Windy saying that he's got no time to watch TV, and if he thinks it's bad with a baby, try it with a toddler or a 5-year-old who really wants to watch Bluey all the time. Number 5, Rule the Roost, the subject of the podcast that I put out a couple of days ago. Please go listen to that if you haven't already. I've had a lovely response to it. Coming in with 18 curse words, Flab was on the show from The Fighting Cock, And him and Jack go way back, so there was some really fun chemistry to listen to. And it was also nice to hear Flav outside of the host role that he often occupies on The Fighting Cock, or Football Between the Lines, or The Lab. And at times he was reflecting on sort of his role as a podcaster in his career, which was interesting, especially as somebody who's kind of embarking on their own podcasting journey, I suppose. Although they only mentioned 18 curse words, I wasn't sure whether or not to give them credit for the mention of, quote, furiously masturbating. I'll leave that up to you guys to know whether I should have put them at 19 curse words. But it wouldn't have put them in the number 4 spot, which was occupied, shockingly to me, by The Fighting Cock. I thought this was going to come in at number 1. They had 35 curse words. Flav is back from his, I think, hernia operation. He was joined by Alex from Bristol and Billy T of Hometown Glory, and also the Change for Tottenham movement. So there was a lot of protest talk. They focused on fan frustrations and the atmosphere at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a new episode of The Lab on how Spurs can win the Europa. Coming in shockingly for me at number 3 was The Game Is About Glory, with 41 curse words. This was probably driven by a slightly tipsy Steph, and an extensive discussion of Thunder Bastards, goals with what could be described as an awesome trajectory. Something that I found pretty funny about The Game Is About Glory's distribution of curse words was that they were the only podcast that I assessed that used a curse word from every category that I assessed, leading some weight to them as what I consider to be one of the most verbose Tottenham podcasts. Coming in at number 2 was Tottenham Depot, and actually the impetus for me deciding to count up how many swear words, how much profanity was in each podcast. So thank you, TC, for teaching my 5-year-old daughter the word fucking. Listen to this if you want to hear TC go on a rant. It is extensive. It is not quite epic, but it is impressive. And I felt that Carolyn handled him well. And she also made a great point about the way an incident in the game had effectively pitted player against player, and that kind of psychology I found interesting to consider. They also coined the phrase Angemosity, so Ange animosity as a portmanteau, which is dangerously close to Ange Moisty when you type it into your phone. And coming in at number 1 as the most sweary, bluest Tottenham podcast that I assessed and listened to this week was Tottenham Boys Making All the Noise, with 72 curse words, approximately 1 curse word per minute. I was excited to look back to these guys after a win. I listened to them last week for the first time. I enjoyed their discussion of the offsides. I felt they were emotional but not analytical necessarily, and just generally have a good sense of sort of football dynamics. I found them quite considered. They were measured despite their profanity. And I thought it was interesting that they felt, unlike a lot of the podcasts that I listened to, that Brennan Johnson actually bottled taking the penalty or not. And he kind of put Tell into a position to have to take the penalty. So that's everything. A lot of cursing, a lot of regret on my part. Got some ground to make up with my kid to teach her when to use certain words. And some common themes that I heard this week were relief. You know, we finally won a game. There's a sense that maybe it's the last 3-pointer of the season that we might pick up. And rolling into that was a lot of trepidation about what's to come. People want to be excited, but they don't know if they can allow themselves to be. Some people were trying to actively force themselves into an excited state, but others were just quite gloomy overall. A lot of talk about our forwards, especially Brennan Johnson and Matisse Tell. The role of penalty takers, VAR, the protest came up time and again. So that's really kind of capturing people's attention, as well as obviously Ange and what the future might bring for him and for us. Before I close out, I did get a question from 1991 Semi on Bluesky, just talking about how I listen to podcasts, the sort of context to which I'm listening to these in. So as you've picked up already, Sometimes I'll listen to these as I'm just doing housework, right? Like if I'm loading the dishwasher, if I'm, getting my lunch ready for the next day at work, I'll have my phone on the countertop just playing podcasts out loud. I work an office job, so quite often I'll have a single headphone in and I'll be listening to a podcast pretty much all day. I've upped it recently since I cancelled my Apple Music subscription to save some money. So this has become one of my primary sources of entertainment and things that keep me from wanting to put my face through my monitor at work. I do listen to a lot of podcasts at 1.25 or 1.5 speed, just to kind of grind through them now. I didn't used to do that before I started this podcast, but now I feel a sort of sense of need to cover as much as I can. I feel guilty if I haven't talked about somebody's podcast and I see that it's been put out. So I don't really feel like it changes the vibe too much, but there's certainly a sense of rushing. When I listen to a main podcast that I'm going to focus on, I will listen to that in regular speed to get a real sense of the show. And yeah, I also listen to it in the car. I'd love to say I listen to it at the gym, but I'm unfortunately not that way inclined. So yeah, so Spurs won a game. Podcasters were somewhat happy, somewhat despondent, and we move on and see what Frankfurt on Thursday brings us. So keep making podcasts, keep subscribing and sharing the show with your friends. It's been a lot of fun for me to get feedback and to talk about what I'm noticing in these shows. So thanks. This is an awkward end. Bye.